There is a stretch of water, barely 39 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, that on any ordinary day carries roughly a fifth of the world's oil and gas to the rest of the planet. For most of this year, it has carried almost nothing. Tankers sit anchored offshore near Bandar Abbas, engines idle, crews waiting on instructions that never quite arrive. Somewhere in Washington and somewhere in Tehran, two governments have just watched a deadline they both agreed to expire, and neither one is willing to say what happens now. A ceasefire that was supposed to end a war has instead become a countdown to a question nobody can answer. Does the clock running out mean peace, or does it mean the war that paused in the spring is about to resume in the second half of the year? To understand why a single expired deadline over a single strait of water has become one of the most dangerous flashpoints on Earth, you have to go back to the morning everything started, 5 months before anyone had heard the number 60. The roots of this confrontation reach back further than most viewers realize. Back to 1979, when the Iranian Revolution toppled the American-backed Shah, and the subsequent hostage crisis at the United States Embassy in Tehran set the tone for more than 4 decades of mutual hostility between the two governments. That hostility eased only briefly in 2015 when Iran and a group of world powers signed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, a deal that traded sanctions relief for strict limits on Iran's nuclear program. The United States withdrew from that agreement in 2018, and every attempt to revive some version of it in the years since collapsed under the weight of mutual distrust. Iran's expanding ballistic missile arsenal and its growing military footprint across the region through allied militias in Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, and Syria. By late 2025, those failed negotiations had left both Washington and Jerusalem convinced that time was running out to prevent Iran from reaching a nuclear weapons threshold, and Tehran convinced that concession after concession had bought it nothing but further isolation. It was into that combustible atmosphere that the operation of February 2026 was launched. On the 28th of February 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated military operation against Iran, a strike so precise and so ambitious that its stated goal was nothing less than decapitating the Iranian state. Intelligence gathered by the CIA fed target data to the Israeli Air Force, and in the opening hours of the operation, Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was killed, along with dozens of senior military and government officials. It was the culmination of tensions that had been building for years, rooted in Iran's nuclear program, its ballistic missile arsenal, and the collapse of diplomatic efforts to revive the 2015 nuclear agreement that had once constrained it. Iran's government confirmed Khamenei's death within days, declared 40 days of national mourning, and installed an interim leadership council as the country scrambled to answer a question it had never had to face in nearly 4 decades. Takters, who leads the Islamic Republic when its founding figure of the post-revolutionary era is suddenly gone. The strikes did not stop at Iran's top leadership. A missile struck a school near a naval base in Manab, close to Bandar Abbas, killing close to 170 people, many of them girls. It was one of the deadliest single incidents of the opening days of the war, and it hardened Iranian public opinion at precisely the moment its government was most fractured. Iran's response was immediate and expansive. Within hours, missiles and drones were launched not just at Israel, but at American military installations and energy infrastructure across the Middle East, and Iranian forces moved to close the Strait of Hormuz to shipping entirely. For a country that could not match American or Israeli air power directly, the strait was the one piece of leverage capable of touching every economy on Earth at once. By the 4th of March, that leverage had already reshaped global oil markets. Brent crude surged past $120 a barrel. Qatar's massive liquefied natural gas export operation was forced to declare force majeure, and the combined oil output of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Iraq fell by more than 10 million barrels a day within 2 weeks. The International Energy Agency would later describe it as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market, language usually reserved for the 1973 oil embargo, and for the first time in decades, analysts began seriously discussing the possibility of a full-blown 1970s-style stagflation crisis playing out in real time. What followed was not a swift military resolution, but a grinding stalemate that stretched through the spring. The United States began an aerial campaign in mid-March aimed specifically at reopening the strait, striking Iranian naval vessels and drone launch sites along the coast. President Trump issued a public 48-hour ultimatum in early April, warning that Iran's power plants and bridges would be destroyed if the waterway was not reopened. Iran refused to negotiate under what it called pressure, and on the 13th of April, the United States escalated further, imposing a full naval blockade on Iranian ports rather than simply trying to force the strait open by force. That blockade, according to United States Central Command, intercepted 85 vessels and seized 3 ships outright. And by the Pentagon's own estimate, it was costing Iran roughly $500 million a day in lost oil revenue. Iran responded in kind, seizing 2 foreign cargo ships of its own. Neither side was winning outright. Both were bleeding. By late spring, the human and economic toll had become undeniable even to those far from the region. Wikipedia's running tally of the maritime crisis recorded at least 17 merchant ships damaged, several of them abandoned entirely, 2 ships captured, and 12 seafarers killed or missing, alongside a tugboat sunk and a port worker killed in Bahrain. The war itself, by broader estimates from Britannica and other outlets tracking it, had by that point killed thousands across Iran, Israel, Lebanon, and the Gulf states, and displaced millions. It was against this backdrop of exhaustion on every side that diplomacy finally produced something concrete. On the 18th of June 2026, in Islamabad, the United States and Iran signed a memorandum of understanding intended to end the war, not just pause it. Under Article 5 of that agreement, Iran committed to clearing mines from the Strait of Hormuz and allowing commercial vessels to pass through free of charge for 60 days, a window meant to rebuild trust and buy time for a wider, more permanent settlement covering sanctions relief, frozen Iranian assets, and Iran's nuclear ambitions. President Trump greeted the news with characteristic bravado, telling the world's shipping industry to start its engines and let the oil flow again. For a moment, it looked like the worst was over. Oman played a quiet but crucial role in these negotiations, hosting and facilitating channels between American and Iranian officials who could not and still cannot speak to each other directly through normal diplomatic means, a role the Sultanate has played repeatedly in Gulf crises over the decades, precisely because it maintains working relationships with both Washington and Tehran that few other governments can claim. Reporting in early August suggested American negotiators were quietly softening their public hardline stance behind closed doors, even as Trump's own rhetoric remained aggressive, with Secretary of State Marco Rubio drawing a distinction between what he called the immediate deal over the strait itself and the larger, far more complicated negotiations still to come over Iran's nuclear ambitions, sanctions, and its regional militia network. That distinction matters because it suggests that even if the Hormuz question were somehow resolved, the deeper sources of the conflict, the nuclear program at its core, would remain entirely unaddressed. It was not. The vague wording of the Islamabad memorandum turned out to be its fatal flaw. The two sides could not agree on who actually controlled the strait or which shipping routes vessels should use to pass through it safely. A proposal reported by Axios suggested a compromise. Ships entering the Gulf would travel a northern route through Iranian waters, while ships leaving would use a southern route coordinated through Oman. But the arrangement never solidified into anything both governments accepted. Within weeks, the deal that was supposed to end the war had effectively collapsed, even as both sides continued to publicly claim to be honoring it. Iran accused Washington of never releasing the frozen funds it had promised, of failing to lift sanctions, of keeping its naval blockade in place, and of not pressing Israel to withdraw from positions it held in southern Lebanon. The United States accused Iran of failing to genuinely open the strait to normal commercial traffic, and of using the pause to rearm. Traffic through Hormuz, which had briefly risen after the interim deal was signed, sank back down to a small fraction of pre-war levels. And by early August, Iran had effectively reclosed the strait again, this time explicitly citing what it called an American attempt to establish an alternative shipping route without its consent. Washington, in turn, reinstated the naval blockade it had briefly eased, which brings the story to where it stands right now. The 60-day window set out in the Islamabad memorandum expired this past Monday, and the two governments cannot even agree on what its expiration means. Iran's position, laid out by its deputy foreign minister, Kazem Garibabadi, and its top nuclear negotiator, Abbas Araghchi, is that the Islamabad memorandum was never a ceasefire that could be extended or allowed to lapse in the first place. It was, in their framing, meant to be the actual end of the war. Because the United States continued military pressure and never fulfilled its commitments, Iran argues there was no functioning 60-day ceasefire to begin with, meaning the deadline's expiration changes nothing legally, and Tehran never formally entered talks about extending it. The American position, at least as expressed publicly by President Trump, is considerably more combative. Speaking to a crowd in New York on Friday, he said flatly that there was, in his words, nobody left to negotiate with. He has described the ongoing American blockade as a wall of steel around Iran's coastline, and he has floated language that would have been unthinkable in earlier decades of American-Iran policy, suggesting the United States might simply declare the Strait of Hormuz itself to be American territory. Iran's deputy foreign minister answered that claim directly and unambiguously, insisting the strait was Iran's, is Iran's, and will remain Iran's. What makes this moment different from the earlier ultimatums of March and April is exhaustion layered on top of unresolved grievance. 6 months into a war that both sides initially framed as capable of quick resolution, there's no appetite left for further concessions on either side. And yet there is also no accepted mechanism for stepping back from confrontation. Trump has publicly acknowledged the economic cost at home, urging Americans to accept paying a bit more for fuel, even as gasoline prices climbed past $4 a gallon in parts of the United States, and domestic inflation readings, tracked by outlets like Bloomberg Economics, jumped from roughly 2.5% year over year in February to well above 3% by March, driven almost entirely by energy costs. That is the visible, easily measured cost. The less visible cost is happening inside Iran itself, where a country already isolated by sanctions and now cut off from much of its own oil export revenue is watching inflation soar and its economy buckle under the weight of war and blockade simultaneously. Iran experienced brutal protests in January that were forcibly suppressed, and analysts tracking the region now warn that continued economic collapse could reignite that unrest at exactly the moment the government, still adjusting to new leadership under Khamenei's son and successor Mojtaba, can least afford internal instability layered on top of external war. The economic modeling behind these numbers is worth pausing on because it explains why this is not simply a regional story. Roughly 20 million barrels of oil moved through the Strait of Hormuz every single day before the war, representing close to a fifth of all petroleum liquids consumed on the planet, and more than a quarter of all oil moved by sea globally. The United States Energy Information Administration's own analysis found that Middle Eastern producers had cut output by more than 11 million barrels a day at the peak of the crisis, driving the fastest inventory drawdown in decades, pushing stockpiles in wealthy OECD countries to their lowest level since 2003. The International Energy Agency has since had to revise its 2026 global oil demand forecast downward twice, most recently estimating that high fuel prices and the continued closure of Hormuz will suppress worldwide oil demand by 1.6 million barrels a day this year alone, a bleaker number than the agency was projecting even a month earlier. Some energy analysts, including FGE's Feridun Fasharaki, warned as early as March that a prolonged near closure of the strait could push crude prices as high as $150 to $200 a barrel, a scenario that independent modeling by Bloomberg Economics suggested could roughly double the inflation and growth damage already being felt across Europe and the United States. The United Nations Conference on Trade and Development has separately documented how this burden falls hardest not on wealthy oil importing nations, who can absorb higher prices, but on the world's most vulnerable economies. Countries like Jordan and Lebanon, which depend almost entirely on Gulf crude for both energy and imported goods, and nations like Bangladesh and Pakistan, exposed through both crude oil and liquefied petroleum gas imports, have seen the sharpest relative increases in fuel and gasoline costs of any region measured, even as wealthier economies absorb the shock more easily. There's also a quieter, more structural question sitting underneath all of this, one that receives far less attention than the daily back and forth of ultimatums and rhetoric. Even if a genuine, lasting agreement were reached tomorrow, would global oil markets simply snap back to where they were before February? The evidence increasingly suggests they would not. Analysts modeling the crisis for organizations like Solability have noted that the economic damage compounds daily beyond the headline oil price, spreading into liquefied natural gas markets, fertilizer supply chains dependent on Gulf feedstocks, and sharply elevated shipping insurance premiums for any vessel willing to risk the war risk zone around the strait, costs that do not simply disappear the moment a ceasefire is announced. Gulf-producing states and Iraq have been losing an estimated $1.1 billion a day in oil revenue for every day. The strait remains effectively closed, a bleeding wound for economies that, unlike Iran, were not even party to the underlying conflict. Congress's own research service noted in early August that the current uneasy status quo, neither full war nor genuine peace, could persist for as long as both Washington and Tehran calculate that they can absorb the military and economic costs of an effectively closed strait better than their opponent can. A grim kind of endurance contest playing out through tanker traffic, statistics, and inflation reports rather than open battle. That leaves the essential, unresolved question hanging over everything else. Was the Islamabad Memorandum ever a real peace agreement, or was it always a temporary pause that both sides used to rearm and reposition before returning to a fight neither had actually finished? The evidence supports elements of both interpretations, and honest analysis has to acknowledge that genuine uncertainty rather than pretend one side's narrative is simply correct. Iran's argument that Washington failed to deliver its committed sanctions, relief and asset unfreezing carries documented weight, reported consistently by outlets, including Al Jazeera and the Associated Press tracking the memorandum's implementation. The American argument that Iran never restored normal, unimpeded commercial shipping through the strait as promised is equally well documented, reflected directly in shipping traffic data, showing volumes falling back to a small fraction of pre-war levels almost as soon as the initial optimism faded. Both governments, in other words, appear to have kept just enough of their commitments to claim compliance publicly, while withholding just enough to blame the other side for the collapse. That ambiguity was baked into the vague wording of Article 5 from the very beginning, and 6 months into the conflict, it has become the central mechanism by which both sides avoid taking responsibility for a peace that never fully materialized. What happens from here remains genuinely unknown, and any responsible account of this story has to say so plainly rather than manufacture false certainty. There is no scheduled resumption of talks between Washington and Tehran as of this week. There is no new deadline publicly agreed to replace the one that just expired. Trump's rhetoric about declaring the Strait American territory has no clear legal or military pathway behind it that analysts have been able to identify, and it may be more a negotiating posture than a literal policy intention. But in a conflict that has already produced one of the most consequential assassinations of a sitting head of state in the 21st century, dismissing provocative rhetoric as merely rhetorical carries its own risks. Iran, for its part, retains a military that has been degraded but not destroyed, an economy under severe strain but not yet collapsed, and a leadership transition that appears to have stabilized around Mojtaba Khamenei without triggering the kind of total governmental breakdown some analysts initially predicted in the days after his father's assassination. Both nations have now spent roughly 6 months demonstrating that they can absorb extraordinary costs, military, economic, and human, without changing their fundamental positions. And there is little in the record of the past 6 months to suggest that a 7th month of pressure alone will produce the breakthrough that the previous 6 did not. What the expiration of this particular deadline really represents, then, is not a single moment of decision, but a marker of how thoroughly diplomacy and military pressure have each, separately, failed to resolve this conflict on their own terms. The Islamabad Memorandum was built on the assumption that 60 days of open shipping would rebuild enough trust to make a comprehensive settlement possible. Instead, the ambiguity in its wording became the very thing both sides exploited to avoid compromise, and the deadline meant to mark progress toward peace. Instead, became just another data point in a war of attrition, being fought as much through oil markets and inflation statistics as through missiles and airstrikes. For the merchant crews still anchored off Bandar Abbas, for the tanker operators recalculating insurance premiums they cannot afford, for the families in Amman and Beirut and Dhaka absorbing fuel price increases they had no part in causing, the geopolitical framing of ultimatums and territorial claims matters far less than a simpler, harder truth. The world's most important shipping route has now been effectively closed, in whole or in part, for nearly 6 months, and the two governments capable of reopening it permanently have just watched their own deadline for doing so expire without agreement, without a fixed plan for what comes next, and without any indication that either side is prepared to be the one who blinks first. There is a pattern worth noticing in how this conflict has unfolded, one that distinguishes it from earlier Middle Eastern crises that eventually found their way to resolution through sheer exhaustion. In most protracted conflicts, rising costs on both sides eventually create pressure toward compromise because continuing to fight becomes more expensive than the concessions needed to stop. 6 months into the Hormuz crisis, that logic has not yet taken hold. Iran is losing an estimated $500 million a day to the American blockade, and watching its currency and public trust erode simultaneously. Yet its government has calculated that capitulating on the strait, the one piece of geographic leverage it possesses over the entire global economy, would cost it more strategically than the economic pain of holding out. The United States, meanwhile, is absorbing inflation, elevated gas prices, and diplomatic friction with allies dependent on Gulf energy, yet has calculated that a negotiated settlement seen as rewarding Iran's closure of an international waterway would undermine the credibility of the very ultimatums it has issued since March. Both governments, in effect, have talked themselves into positions where backing down looks more costly than continuing to bear the price of confrontation, even as that price climbs for everyone else in the world who had no say in starting this war. The final piece of this story, and perhaps the most sobering one, is what a resumption of full-scale conflict would actually mean for a global economy that has already been running on reduced Gulf oil supply for half a year. Analysts who modeled worst-case scenarios back in March, when oil first spiked past $120 a barrel, warned that a price surge toward $150 or $200 a barrel would roughly double the inflationary and growth damage already being felt. A shock capable of reshaping central bank policy, election outcomes, and household budgets from Tokyo to Toledo. 6 months on, the buffers that might have absorbed a fresh shock, strategic petroleum reserves, alternative shipping routes, spare production capacity elsewhere in the world, have already been drawn down responding to the first 6 months of disruption. A second escalation now would not be starting from where the world stood in February. It would be starting from a global energy system already stretched thinner than at any point since the oil shocks of the 1970s, facing a conflict whose central dispute, over 60 days in a stretch of water, has just proven itself impossible to resolve through diplomacy, force, or the simple passage of time. Whatever comes next in the Strait of Hormuz, it will not be decided by the calendar. It will be decided by which government, after 6 months of mutual punishment, finally decides that certainty, even an unfavorable certainty, is worth more than the standoff both have been willing to sustain.